In the early 19th century, there is no building site in early America that has as many artisans, laborers, and materials coming together over the course of a decade for the realization of a single building project as the University of Virginia. Hello everybody, my name is Louis Nelson. I'm a professor in the Department of Architectural History, and I've had the great honor of teaching here at the University of Virginia for almost a quarter century. I love to teach the Academical Village to our students here at the university, and in part because our students and many of our alumni and our larger community has a deep, deep appreciation for this UNESCO World Heritage Site, because it is one of the most important design complexes in early America. We often think of the Academical Village as springing forth from the mind of Jefferson as a finished product, as a complete and mature design complex. But that's not really how it worked. Jefferson was distracted, there were bursts of energy, and there were months and years in which he's paying almost no attention. Built over the course of a decade, in fits and starts, the architecture of the University of Virginia is this fascinating project for understanding a design process. And one of the best tools we have to understand the complexity of that process is to look closely at Thomas Jefferson's original design drawings. These 5 pieces of paper give us an amazing and important snapshot of the design process of the Academical Village. He then creates this second version that he uses as an overlay. Because he's just carved this out, he can do that again. What's interesting about this one, you can see that the grid begins right at the columnar sequence. All of the details that Jefferson is working out for the measurements of various components. For Jefferson, the mathematical proportions of the column are absolutely essential. You flip this drawing over, and it is the only pavilion drawing that has no notations on the back. Why is this drawing the only one with no notations? The University of Virginia is the perfect and most premier example of what Jefferson imagined Republican architecture to be. And so the drawings are a window into Jefferson's imagination that his letters will never reveal for us. It's a fun journey. Come with me.
How's everybody doing this afternoon? Yeah. Everybody glad to be here? I'm Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the Office of Engagement. It's a pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. We're celebrating Thomas Jefferson's birthday, his 282nd birthday, I believe it is. So happy birthday, Mr. Jefferson. This program is being recorded. It'll be available on the Office of Engagement's Lifetime Learning website in just a few weeks. So tune in, come back, join us, and share it with your friends. It's a great opportunity to share a lecture that we produce. We produce many programs in person and virtual programs, as well as those online. Before we begin, go ahead and silence the ringer on your phone. If you have a question, if you would, hold it to the end of the program. A microphone will be passed around for you to ask a question. Just ask one brief question and speak right into that microphone for us so everyone can hear it. Now, we have the pleasure of welcoming our speaker for this annual program. Louis P. Nelson is our speaker. He's a professor of architectural history in the School of Architecture and the Vice Provost for Academic Outreach in the Office of Executive Vice President and Provost. He is a specialist in the built environments of the early modern Atlantic world with published works on the American South, the Caribbean, and West Africa. Nelson is an accomplished scholar and a noteworthy author with 7 books. That's right, 7 books to his name. His 2016 publication, The Architecture and Empire in Jamaica, won 3 major book awards and was positively reviewed in 12 literary journals. I had the pleasure of traveling with Louis to Paris, France back in 2017. We traveled in the footsteps of Thomas Jefferson throughout France, throughout Paris, and it was absolutely a wonderful, rich experience, one I will not soon forget. It was a really great experience. We hope to offer that program again in the future. Please help me join me in helping to welcome Louis Nelson as our speaker for this program. Thank you. Thanks, Louis.
Hello, everybody. When you get an email, this is a tip. When you get an email from Althea Brooks, the answer is yes. I have always said yes to Althea. I love the opportunity to engage with alumni engagement, and also am so appreciative of the ways that I've been able to both travel with Althea and put together programs that help us better understand the richness of knowledge that comes from this place, but also the history of the place itself. So I've been teaching at UVA for 25 years. I am not trained as a Jefferson scholar. In fact, I was quite certain that I would never write a book or give a lecture about Thomas Jefferson. My work is elsewhere. But about 5 years ago, my great senior colleague, Richard Guy Wilson, who has always had the sort of honor of teaching the architecture of Jefferson, retired. And somebody needed to teach Jefferson. And so I had the great pleasure of stepping into that space. And let me tell you, that man's bite is big. Once you start teaching Jefferson, you're like, wow, there's so much to work with here. So it's been a great delight to dive in over these last few years. And yes, I am now working on a book on Thomas Jefferson, something I said I would never do. But here we are. And this is a great pleasure. This is my first unpacking, actually in a public venue, of the a portion of one of the chapters of the book. And so I'm really interested to hear y'all sort of offer some feedback and ask some questions as I unpack some of this content. And this is a dialogue. This will be an opportunity. There will be moments where I ask a question and you'll go, is that rhetorical? No, the answer is I'm actually looking for an answer, right? So in those awkward silences, step right in and yell something out, because I'm actually looking for that. All right. Let us begin. The image on the bottom left is probably an image, I hope is an image that's familiar to you. This is Tanner's view of the University of Virginia, a space we now call the Academical Village, produced in 1827. This is produced right after Jefferson has passed, and actually the artwork that undergirds this print is probably underway while Jefferson is still alive. We know that because, in fact, the building complex isn't entirely finished. So even though this looks like it's a finished, the image is a representation of the finished complex, it's actually not, right? The artist is finishing out a few of those little final building details. But you might ask, why on earth am I offering the, why on earth am I comparing this Tanner view in 1827 of the Academical Village with this Renaissance portrait of the Birth of Venus by Botticelli? That's a good question. Well, if we might actually think then about the content. What is Botticelli in this late Renaissance painting trying to represent? Representing the birth of the goddess of love. The birth of a completely finished goddess with no actual history, no development, right? No growth. She's not born as a baby, she's born as an adult. And I show this image because I want to posit that we often think of the Academical Village springing forth from Jefferson's imagination whole cloth, like a finished thing, like Venus on the half shell. And in fact, that's not at all the case. And so our story today, our lecture today, will be an unpacking of that arc over time. How did Jefferson guide this design project to result in a thing that is the finished product that is the Academical Village? It's important for us to remember that this design process happened in real space and in real time. This, of course, is Jefferson's studio, part of his little private sequence at the one end of Monticello. And you can see on the far right the architect's drafting table, right? That table tips up. This is actually where he's producing these drawings. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is to think about the physical nature of the drawings themselves. What can the drawings themselves actually tell us about Jefferson's design process that letters that Jefferson produces can't, right? Is there evidence? Is there a story in the actual physical production of the drawings? And so let's actually analyze then some of those drawings. I have here on the screen just the most popular, the most famous, and probably the most important of that sequence. 14 drawings, there are many more. 14 drawings that Jefferson produces over the course of about 6 years for the design process of the Academical Village. I have them organized here in a certain way. And that is, can you see that they are the lawn? Right? I just want to orient you to it. So this is Pavilion 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. That's the west lawn, right? And here we have 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. That's the east lawn. The 2 halves, 5 pavilions on either side of the lawn. I'll show you a view of the lawn itself in a moment. And then, of course, 4 of the drawings for the rotunda in the middle because I couldn't squinch them at the end where the rotunda should actually be. And so this is the body of drawings we're going to be working with for the next half hour, 40 minutes, right? So I just wanted to introduce them to you in sequence as we're beginning to think about, what kinds of questions can we actually ask of the drawings themselves? You're also going to see this image a couple times. This is a digital model that School of Architecture students, primarily undergraduates, have been producing over the last decade. This is an incredibly important project, in part because, here I get to geek out, and this is a different lecture, but this is accurate to the inch. Just pause on that for a second. Think about scale. Over 10 years, dozens of undergraduate students, working especially with experts in the library who have supported this project, have helped us produce this digital model. In part because this digital model can actually represent the Academical Village. In this instance, it's about 1850 or so. But Jim Ryan wasn't particularly eager for me to get into Bulldozer and just start plowing down anything that postdates the original construction of the Academical Village. So if we want to visualize the early Academical Village, this digital model is a really helpful tool, and we use it in other ways for our analysis of the early built environment. But I'm just going to show it to you a couple times. I wanted to orient you both to the digital model, but also to just the scene, right? So for those of you, I'm assuming that everybody has walked the lawn, but just in case you haven't, this, of course, is the lawn itself, the 3 terraces, the 3 flat terraces that cascade down from the rotunda, 5 pavilions on either side. We'll be spending most of our time looking at those. A brief comment around the hotels that are on the ranges at the far end. And you can even see in this, it's actually, the Academical Village is built on a naturally occurring ridgeline. Jefferson actually quite smartly uses the topography, the existing topography of the landscape, to great effect. And we'll explore that just a little bit as well. Okay, so this is our first drawing. Let's begin to actually, what kind of questions, what can we observe about these drawings? This is the drawing for Pavilion 3, right? So the second on the left on the west side, part of the earliest wave of his construction. So if we look at the verso here, the front side, the rectos in the back, we observe that there's actually 4 drawings on this, right? In the bottom right-hand side here is what? Real question. The facade or the elevation, right? The way that one sees the building from its outside, this is the elevation. And for Jefferson, we'll see this is probably the most important component of the building for Jefferson. He cares the most about the classical architectural details, we'll talk about that, as well as the mathematics. We'll spend less time talking about that because they're super complicated. But the mathematics of the elevation itself. He cares deeply about the elevation. But a building is not just an elevation, is it? You actually have to have rooms to go into. And so Jefferson represents then, on this drawing, the elevation here on the bottom right-hand side, and then 3 floor plans, right? Do you see the 3 floor plans? I'll just orient you. This is the main floor. So this is the ground floor here. This is subterranean, right? You'll remember that Jefferson built it on a ridgeline. These buildings appear to be 3 stories from the back side. They are 2 stories from the front side. He uses the 3 stories to manage the transition in the elevation. What happens in the ground floor? What happens in the cellar floor of the pavilion? Real question? That's the kitchen, right? So the enslaved population that is producing meals to support the infrastructure of the house, they're working and laboring down here. This is the upper story, the second story. You can see that here. The floor plan for the second story. What's happening upstairs? That's his residence, right? So the professor, every pavilion is the residence of a professor. The residence is actually the upper story. Those are actually his private chambers. Downstairs is the classroom and either a library and or a study, eventually possibly also a dining room. So main floor, there's the classroom space. And in this instance, you can see there's 2 doors on the front elevation of Pavilion 3. This is the second pavilion he designs. You can see there's a door directly into the classroom and a separate door into this hallway that gives access to the professor's library and then upstairs into his private quarters. So the 2 doors on the front of the pavilion actually represent 2 different kind of functional landscapes, right? There's the classroom space and then there's the private residence for the professor. You flip that drawing over, and this is the back side of that drawing, and you can see kind of 3 clusters of text. If we take a look at the larger cluster of text, what he's working out here actually is the mathematics of the height of the column, and we'll do a little bit more definitional work on that. These are actually Corinthian columns, but we'll talk about that. He's working out the specific proportional relationships mathematically of those columns on this side. And then you can see, do you notice that these 2 bits of ink look a little different from this ink? Yeah, this is darker, right? What Jefferson seizes on a certain formula that he thinks is going to be incredibly important, and that is the best way to estimate the cost of a building is to be able to estimate the number of bricks. That there's a direct correlation between the number of bricks a building has and the ultimate final cost for the construction of that building. So with that as a particular premise, Jefferson works out here bricks by previous calculation. Bricks by previous calculation. What Jefferson is doing there is he's like, okay, I've designed the building. Now I'm going to estimate the number of bricks, and this is that particular calculation. Interestingly, he's recording all of this all on the same piece of paper. So the paper, that one piece of paper is not just a drawing, but it's a repository of the mathematics and the calculations that he's producing. But then at the bottom, you'll actually see, can some of you in the front see this? Can you read those words? Anybody? Bricks employed actually, right? So 2 different recording sequences prior to construction. He's like, previous calculations, this is what I think this will cost. And then afterwards, he's actually had someone count all of the bricks in the finished building and recorded all of that. This drawing then becomes this repository of information both about the design vision, but also the costing, as well as the mathematics of the formulation. But that's just the ink on the paper. Do you notice anything about the paper itself? This side is gridded, this side is not. Okay, so it's a piece of paper that's only got a gridded sequence printed on one side of that paper. We know that Jefferson returns from Paris with big stacks of printed grid paper, this fancy new invention coming out of Paris. Okay, so this is some of that Parisian gridded paper. Do you also, one other feature I want you to observe about this piece of paper. Do you see this? It's been folded. So at some point, someone, maybe Jefferson, maybe someone else, folded this into quarters and stuffed it into a pocket, probably to take it on site, to then pull it out and look at it relative to the building under construction, right? So this is actually a drawing that's not just a vision of something, it's actually probably being taken to the site for work on site. Everybody with me? Okay, so this is what most of the 10 drawings are actually like. I walk through this one so you get a sense for the character. But there's actually one more piece that I didn't observe until I went to pull these drawings out of special collections and look at them very closely. And that is, do you see the grid paper? What are these down here? Those are numbers, right? There's deciles. 190, 200, 210, 220, 230, right? And then up this side, I can't quite read the numbers, but there's also a numeric sequence that runs on that side. Now, right out of the gate, what does that make you ask? What do they represent? Yeah, what are those numbers, right? And if we actually realize that almost all of these drawings have numbers, but none of those numbers go from 0 to 230, we come quickly to realize, oh, Jefferson is saving paper. Jefferson, this piece of paper is 1/4 of a larger sheet, right? That could be quite telling. Okay, Log that away as well. All right, so we do know that this is Pavilion 7. Pavilion 7 is the first of the pavilions to be designed and built by Thomas Jefferson. We know that the cornerstone is laid for this building in October of 1819. That's widely recorded. But it also is a building that visually differs from the rest of the pavilions. Does anybody know how? Yes, you've got it. What are they? Arches. Right? All of the other pavilions they're columns, and exclusively columns. This is the only pavilion that has arches. Oh, that's interesting. That tells us that Jefferson's first imaginary for the pavilions was that they were going to be, we always know that they're going to be classical columns, but that they're classical columns sitting up on top of this arcade, right? Which is a sequence that he's already deployed at his house at Poplar Forest, if you know that building, right? This is a familiar vocabulary for classicism that Jefferson's already deployed, right? But it's the only one like that, which tells us he changes his mind. He designs one, then he goes, I'm not sure I like that. I'm going to pivot. What's a different alternative, right? And here is the really interesting piece, and I put this in the video that you saw ahead of time as well. This is the drawing for Pavilion 7, right? Just like the drawing for Pavilion 3 that I showed you. Ignore the color difference. Let me just say this really quickly. These have been photographed under different lighting conditions. The coloring of the original pieces of paper are all the same. I know this one looks yellow, the last one looked purple. That's just the lamp that's being used for photography. So that's not actually evidentially helpful. But so what do we have here? Just as we have before, we've got an elevation. We've got 3 floor plans. This is the main floor plan, right? This is the upstairs, the professor's apartment, and that's the basement, right? Just like the other drawing. Interestingly, this is the very first building. It's also got 2 doors, a door that goes directly into the classroom and a door that goes into a hallway that gives access to the upper story apartments, right? So none of that is a surprise. That feels like it's part of the regular rhythm that we've already encountered with a couple other drawings. Except what? What's on the back? Absolutely nothing, right? That's a problem, because this is the only drawing that has nothing on the back. That's the problem for me that triggered this whole sequence of investigation. The absence of the notations. Why? Why are there no notations on this drawing in particular? It's the very first one. Wouldn't it have the most? Hold on to that thought. Okay. So what is the larger arc of Jefferson's imagination for the development of this whole complex? We know that Jefferson, of course, is educated where? The College of William and Mary, go Tribe. Yeah, that never goes over well. So he's educated, of course, at the College of William and Mary, a place he detests. And so by 1805, he is asked by the then governor, hey, you're talking about this new university. He's already stirring the pot as early as 1805 about founding a new university. And so he asks Jefferson for some advice. And this is what Jefferson writes back. Large houses, like the College of William and Mary, large houses are always ugly, inconvenient, exposed to the accident of fire, and bad in case of infection. Now, I want to pause before we go on. These are 4 complaints, 4 reasons not to build a major single, a large singular building. The first is what? It's just ugly. It fails aesthetically. So aesthetics are important to Jefferson, right? As early as 1805. What's next? They're inconvenient. What does he mean by that? If I want to go see a professor, and that professor's on the 3rd floor or up in the garret, I've got to walk there all the way up the staircase, walk down the hallway again, right? It doesn't actually, it is inconvenient. And it might also be inconvenient because it means the professors and students are actually in chambers next to each other. Ugh, right? Who would want that? Exposed to the accident of fire. Somebody unpack that for me. You get a fire, the whole thing's a goner. Yeah, it's like all or nothing. You're putting all your eggs in one basket, right? Jefferson's like, well, that doesn't seem wise. And lastly, bad in case of infection. This is a different lecture, but Jefferson has also spent time in Paris when Parisian doctors are trying to estimate Why is it that so many Parisians die in the major hospital in central Paris? And they're coming to realize that, and they argue by the end of the product, when Jefferson is there, you actually need to have different, and they use this word, pavilions for patients of different conditions, right? Now, they don't understand infection yet, right, how germs actually spread, but they're beginning to understand, oh, wait a second, if we segregate out into different pavilions or separations by category, that's healthier. So Jefferson here is bringing some of that knowledge from his engagement with these Parisian research scientists in Paris, and he's bringing that back to his design for the University of Virginia. Okay. Continuing, he says, these houses for individual faculty, remember, he argues for 10 faculty, there are 10 domains of knowledge, 10 pavilions. These houses for individual faculty should be connected by covered ways, out of which the rooms of students would open. That sounds familiar, right? Something that we'll eventually see. In fact, he wrote, and university should not be a house, but a village, right? Giving us this language of the academical village. So Jefferson, we've already got a couple different strains of argument here, right? Jefferson is thinking about the fiscal wisdom of putting all of your eggs in one basket relative to fire. He's thinking about the health conditions of buildings that are these monstrous singular buildings, but he's also thinking about aesthetics. I also think he's thinking about the relationship between professors and students specifically. And the reason I think that is because one of the people that Jefferson knows well when he is in Paris, remember that he's in Paris in the 1780s, when he's in Paris, one of the colleagues he knows really well is Quatremère de Quincy. Quatremère de Quincy would be this French Enlightenment philosopher who believed that all knowledge, of course, do you think Jefferson's interested in, when someone says all knowledge, is Jefferson interested? Of course he is. All knowledge should actually be aggregated into books. Producing what? The first encyclopedia. Right? So Quatremère de Quincy is involved in this project in the late 18th century of the production of the first encyclopedia. Jefferson meets with him. Jefferson is one of the very first patrons supporting this particular project. And in fact, Jefferson and Quatremère de Quincy have a conversation. It doesn't work out, but Jefferson for a season is thinking about, I might actually want to be the American advocate for this. Right? I want to translate this into English and have an American version of this and sell it to Americans. So Jefferson is actually going to be the agent. That's the word I'm looking for. Jefferson was going to serve as the agent for this volume. So we know that he knows it. Well, when you look in Quatremère de Quincy's Encyclopédia Méthodique, which is first published in 1789, right after Jefferson has left, this entry on Greek schools of philosophy is very interesting. I'll read it to you. When the highly celebrated philosophers, such as Ptolemy, had many disciples that they could not be accommodated within the enclosure of a garden, they constructed for their use some huts around their master's dwelling, which they called kaliaba in Greek. That is to say, some very primitive huts made of wood and covered with thatch, where the Greek students resided with singular satisfaction. Meanwhile, this manner of living preserved the youth from the city's corruption. Jefferson is notoriously always hating cities for their moral corruption, so that would certainly appeal to Jefferson, and diminished considerably the cost of public education. Jefferson also really cares a lot about funding public education. An accumulation of such habitations presented from afar the appearance of a village where one learned ethics like a trade. Right? Now, Jefferson never says, hey, I just read this, therefore this is shaping my imagination, but we know that there's this direct connection, and I'm pretty convinced, a different scholar made this argument a number of years ago, I'm pretty convinced that she's right, that Jefferson is reading this and using this as a way of birthing the idea of what would become the academical village, and that is a professor in their pavilion surrounded by little huts, right, the lawn rooms on either side, creating the appearance of what? An academical village. Great. So in 1814, Jefferson, by this point, is now definitely stirring the pot to try to help generate interest for a new university in the central portion of Virginia. And he starts this drawing for what would, at that point, be called Albemarle Academy. He produces this drawing in 1814, right? So this is well before the University of Virginia is established. And let's take a look at some of the features of this drawing for this proposed academy. Well, we can see here, right, there's the main house, the house of the philosopher, as it were. were. And here are the rooms, the huts on either side, what would eventually become the lawn rooms for students on either side. We can see here the main classroom on the ground floor, right? This is the covered walkway, the covered colonnade, individual rooms for each of the students on either side, 2 doors that go into, right? There's the one door, and he actually fails to represent the second door that goes to this staircase walkway. We can see that the upper story has the elevation. We see the lower here is the floor plan for the ground floor, and between the two is the floor for the professor's apartment upstairs, right? And so well before he produces any of the drawings that would become the Academical Village, the 10 pavilion drawings, he's already beginning to work out some of the visual formula for what those drawings would look like. And so here we have this particular rendering. I find interesting also the ungridded reverse side of this. This is the section of what I've just shown you. And here you can actually see the plan, as it were, in space. You can see that there are 257 yards intended from the west lawn to the east lawn. This is much wider than what the eventual Academical Village would look like. You can see that each of the pavilions is identical. He produces only 9. And there's a certain sequence of student rooms on either side of the pavilions, all around a big open green space, and there's individual gardens left behind, right? And so when I show folks this, what do you immediately observe as a fundamental difference between this and the eventual Academical Village? There's no rotunda. For Jefferson, the most important building of the Academical Village is the pavilion, right? The residence of the professor. In fact, he would resist the idea of a centralized authority. Jefferson is an anti-federalist, right? He doesn't like centralized authority, even in the infrastructure of a university. We don't have a president until the 20th century. Right? He is a decentralized guy, right? So he doesn't default to this idea of the rotunda. The rotunda is an afterthought, right? His initial infrastructure is simply this, which I find fascinating. Now, by 1816, this is just a few years later, in April, Jefferson would write this letter. He writes to the then governor, and he uses some language we've already seen, and that is, instead of one immense building, which is ugly and inconvenient, of course, to have one small one for every professorship, arranged in proper distances around a square. Jefferson describes each of the intended professors' lodges as, and this is the new language, newly arrived in 1816, exhibiting models in architecture of the purest forms of antiquity, furnishing to the student examples of the precepts that they will be taught in that art. What is new here is that Jefferson decides, oh, wait a second, why would I have every pavilion be the same? If we're building each of these pavilions, each one of them should be different, so as to serve as models for the training of students in the art of architecture, right? And so I've got just three examples here, and this is where we're gonna get to do a little vocabulary training. Some of you had this in middle school, which might have been a few years ago. This is what order of the classical tradition? Does anybody know? The Doric, very well done. You all were properly trained. So here we have the Doric order, this is the Ionic order, and this is the Corinthian order, the 3 fundamentals of classical architecture. If you're going to know anything about classical architecture in the 18th century to the present, you must know these 3 fundamentals, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. We'll turn to that because that's going to be really important. Okay, Jefferson understands, hey, I'm pretty good, but in fact I want to correspond with Benjamin Latrobe, which he does in 1817. Benjamin Latrobe is, at this point in 1817, the most prominent architect in America. Jefferson and Latrobe have partnered a decade earlier, when Jefferson is the president of the United States, on the design for the House of Representatives as part of the US Capitol building, right? Latrobe is the preeminent architect in early America. And he and Jefferson have already worked together for more than a decade. Not at all a surprise that Jefferson would reach out to his colleague and friend and very well-respected architect to say, hey, I'm doing this project of this university in the middle of nowhere. Do you have any ideas? Right? And so Jefferson sends a description. What's interesting, this is Latrobe's letter of response. And I won't go through all the text. The text is fascinating. But Latrobe seizes on this idea immediately. He understands that Jefferson is still in the large open square phase, right? A big open space. So Latrobe just mimics that. And he says, well, you know, you actually should, if you're going to vary the pavilions, look at the sequence, he says. There's an A on either corner, there's B's in the middle, and then there's going to be an E. C is here, D is there. So what Latrobe is suggesting is you should have multiple different options, but that they all should center on, do you see what this is? A domed porticoed building. A domed porticoed building. So the first real suggestion to have a centralized keystone building for the Academical Village is actually traceable to Latrobe, not actually to Jefferson. And so what Latrobe offers is, why don't you think about varying the designs in this way? What Latrobe is doing is something different from what Jefferson would ultimately realize, and that's important. Latrobe, if you do use this relative to bilateral symmetry, right, take a line right down the middle, everything that's on the left is perfectly mirrored on the right-hand side. Do you see that? Latrobe is following the rules of ancient classical architecture. Jefferson will break those rules. What's really interesting about Jefferson's work is that there's a building mirroring on each side, but this building does not look like this building, right? He's willing to break this fundamental rule of classical architecture for the purpose of training up the students in the variable forms of architecture. That will be super interesting. At Jefferson's response, you see here on the right, so Jefferson receives this letter on the left from Latrobe. Jefferson responds and says, oh, we've picked a site. It's going to be much narrower. We're going to have the terraces. And so he actually does this little sketch in the middle of his drawing, in the middle of his letter back. And you can see he's already fallen on the idea of 3 different terraces, but you can see that his idea here is still to have a pavilion, answering a pavilion on either side of the terraces. So there's actually only 6 pavilions in this drawing, in the middle of each of the terraces. So he knows he needs to narrow. He knows he's going to have to terrace the cascading sequence, but he hasn't quite fully realized how's he going to get 10 pavilions on that sequence. That's not quite resolved yet. This, yes?
All these drawings seem to have the opposite end from where the rotunda is going to be open, or is that not down to a square to make a quad?
I'm sorry, ask your question again. I'm not sure that I fully understand.
On the previous slide,
yep.
There's no cap. So the one on the right,
Yes.
you go to the left end of the drawing, it says dot, dot, dot.
Yep.
The one in the front letter, it doesn't show you the end of the diagram.
That's right.
Is this expectations of being told about the quad already, or?
That's right. So Jefferson has no vision yet for a capstone building in his response, right? Jefferson is still just thinking about the pavilions. He's not figured out how he is intending to resolve the 2 ends. He hasn't yet seized on the idea of a keystone building at one end, open at the other. That's not yet part of the design sequence. Great. So in doing this work, I came across this drawing, which actually many of other scholars have looked at before. But I think this drawing is actually a really critical drawing to understand the sequence of the design for the Academical Village. And it's not here at UVA. This is actually part of a smaller collection of drawings that are at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. So I was just up in Massachusetts Historical Society, and I want to take a look at the sequence of this drawing, right? And so can you see what's going on? What do we think is going on in this drawing right here? This is a floor plan, right? This is the main room floor plan. You can see there's the door, there's the central door into the classroom, but yet this is a slightly larger footprint, right? What Jefferson is doing is trying to think about, oh, wait a second, the Pavilion 7 has just that one room. We want a larger footprint, and so this will have an additional room at the back. And so you can see he's trying to create, he creates this hallway around this smaller room. So we have the ground floor plan here. We have the professor's apartment here. But then what is this thing? And I've blown it up here on the right-hand side.
A generic facade?
Is it a generic facade? What else do you think? Other thoughts? Is it maybe a garden? It's the plan of a garden. No, it's not that. Can you see columns? Okay, it's got 4 columns. Do those columns have bases? No, they're just hovering, right? These are columns with no bases, no capitals. There's no resolution to the roof. There's no pediment, right? What on earth is going on? It's a appears to be an incomplete drawing. Jefferson is working out the floor plans, and then he gets to the elevation, and he starts to do the drawing for the elevation, and he just stops. And I'll also just observe two other things. Do you see this fold line? So there's a fold line. So it's a tall, narrow piece of paper. He folds in half. And then what's all of this? Line. That's exactly right. Right? Right? Working late at night, I think Jefferson knocks over a little wine glass, something splashes, and then he gets this scatter staining on the edge of the drawing. So it's been folded, it's stained, and then I was also really perplexed by this hard line. Do you see this hard line that Jefferson draws there? And I think he's producing that hard line. These columns are the columns that are on the front of this building. But I think what Jefferson has done is he's realized in rendering these columns as part of this elevation, it's too close to this. These columns actually look like the backside of that building, right? Do you see that? And so he's created this hard line to kind of create this distinction between the two floor plans, to make it visually, but then he abandons the drawing. And this is actually where we can begin to see that Jefferson's first plan for one of these pavilions maps pretty closely onto this 1814 plan, right? You see the sequences? So there's a kind of spatial logic where he's mapping out this early plan in 1814. We know the date of the one on the left. The one on the right is not dated. 1814 sequence of plans, seems pretty right. Okay, he's just translating that to the next design. Except what's fascinating about this is that this is where the letter base helps us. Jefferson in 1817 of November, remember the cornerstone for Pavilion 7 has just gone in a month before, right? So Pavilion 7, the very first Pavilion 7 is under construction. Jefferson writes to James Madison, "We are sadly at a loss here for a Palladio. I had 3 different editions, but they're at Washington, and nobody in this part of the country has one unless you have. If you have one, you will greatly aid us by letting us have the use of it for a year to come." So Jefferson writes to James Madison, the only other person who would have what he refers to as a Palladio. Who knows what a Palladio is? Yes, ma'am?
It's a tone, four tones of
So it's Andrea Palladio's 4 Books of Architecture, which is an Italian 16th century portfolio of drawings that is recognized widely as the best source for ancient proportions, for ancient models for Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns. Right? And so why is this drawing unfinished? Because he doesn't have the details in the book, right? He can work out the floor plans, he can do the basic proportion for the elevation, but then he can't do those details because he doesn't have the essential reference text. So he requests that text arrives, but Jefferson says, look, I've screwed up the floor plans, they're too close together, I've spilled wine on it, it's unfinished, and what else has he forgotten in this first floor plan? What's not here? Well, the elevation was going to be that. Somebody else has said it. The basement floor plan, right? Jefferson has realized, oh, wait a second, this is a 3-story building, not a 2-story building. I forgot to draw out the cellar plan, right? And so he basically just abandons this drawing. It goes away, he starts all over. Now we have the finished elevation, and we have the 3 floor plans. What's fascinating about this, do you see what this is? It's a little flap, right? Offering versions. Jefferson has decided, ooh, I don't like what's underneath it, I'm going to do it again. What's underneath it is exactly this. So when he produces this drawing, he's perfectly replicating the floor plans on this side. Now, what's wrong with this little room right here? Can you see what's wrong with that room? It's got no windows, right? It's entirely interior, because this hallway completely traps the room on the inside of the floor plan. Think about that for just a second. How might one experience that room? It'd be awful, right? It's got no light. And so Jefferson has, and if you flip the flap up, you have this, oops, that's not what I meant to do. If you flip up this flap, you get that floor plan. And so that's exactly what Jefferson has done. And then he's like, oh, well, if I'm going to redraw the drawing, this is an opportunity for me to fix that problem also, right? So this drawing, the first drawing for an actual pavilion at the university, is a resolution of all these other problems. He's kind of worked them out, and boy, that's a problem. I spilled wine on it. I don't like the distribution. We're gonna go elsewhere. I've been asked to hold questions. If you'll hold your thought, that was was my instruction, was to hold questions. But hold it, and we'll get to it at the end. Okay, and so here we have the sequence then of the first 4 drawings that Jefferson produces for the first 4 pavilions, right? This is pavilion 1, 3, 5, and 7, and here's the actual pavilions themselves. What's fascinating about this is that Jefferson understands that you have to train students in the fundamentals. Remind me again, what are the fundamentals of classical architecture? The 3 orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. What do we have here? Right? So the first 3 buildings that Jefferson ends up constructing are the fundamentals of those 3 first orders. And what's interesting is that they're also, you can't really read it here, each of these also makes a reference that they're from Palladio, right? Doric from Palladio, Ionic from Palladio on the back. This one says the Corinthian from Palladio on the front. Okay? So 7, 5, and 3, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, that's your baseline. But in that first same sequence then, Pavilion 1. What's interesting about Pavilion 1 is that it is also a Doric pavilion. He designs Pavilion 1 and Pavilion 5 at the same time. And when you actually start to think about these in sequence, something interesting surfaces. Look at the floor plans for Pavilion 5 and the floor plans for Pavilion 1. Do you notice any differences? No, there are no differences, right? Jefferson's just getting bored. He's interested in the elevations. He diversifies these elevations, but he's like, this floor plan works, boom, we'll just do it again, right? And so Pavilion 1 and Pavilion 5, just, I don't have time to think of something new, so we're just going to duplicate that floor plan. He actually does that 3 times at the Academical Village. All right, and so Pavilion 1, which is the last in this sequence to be produced, is this elevation. Super interesting. And what's fascinating about this, unlike 7, 5, and 3, which are Palladio's Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, right, the fundamental models, this one is taken from Frère de Chambray, which is a 17th century French tome. And that particular volume, and Jefferson's reference to this, is actually not just generic Doric, but it's a very specific Doric. It's a specific Doric taken from the Baths of Diocletian, right? There's a particular specific ancient example. That's important, right? In part because, and this is a theory I have, that what Jefferson is doing is he's insisting that the diversity of the pavilion elevations shall be models of taste and good architecture, and of a variety of appearance no two alike, so as to serve as specimens for the architectural lecturers. So what Jefferson is doing is he's creating this sequence of the fundamentals from Palladio, but then he's pivoting to a different book, which is a better examples of specific ancient examples of these buildings, and he translates that. Now, interestingly here, what we have is simply the plate, right? Jefferson has the column and the entablature. This is the Frère de Chambray plate. It's not like Chambray is presenting the whole ancient building. It's just a very specific sequence for the order, and then that's exactly what Jefferson replicates on Pavilion 1. Okay, so this is the sequence. 7, 5, 3, and 1 are now in place. They're under construction. This is the first sequence, and then a conversation generates between himself and the Board of Visitors. Right? And there's already a Board of Visitors, and the Board of Visitors asks the question, so how are we going to feed the students? Like, how is this thing actually going to operate? Jefferson's mind is like classical columns, get the math right? Shape the imaginations of these students. Board of Visitors are like, they need to have like lunch. So how's that going to work, right? And so Jefferson pivots, and we know that this conversation's happening in March of 1818. Jefferson pivots to, okay, let me think about the landscape. And that's when we get this really fascinating double-sided plan. Here we can see Pavilion. So he initially numbers them 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is Pavilion 7, this is Pavilion 5, Pavilion 3, Pavilion 1. Those are the same floor plans. And he starts the process of thinking about how will the, what he refers to ultimately to the hotels, which are the big buildings on the range, which is where the dining halls are. And his first sequence, and we know this is the first because this is actually the piece of paper that he cuts out. So this is the very first drawing, and I'll tell you, he doesn't like this solution, so he literally takes an X-Acto knife and he cuts it out of the piece of paper, right, so that he can reproduce it. He doesn't want to have to redraw all of this. But his idea here is this, so there's a hotel, there's a partial hotel, here's different gardens. Do you see that the hotels face this way? So the hotels and the pavilions all face in the same direction. There's some kind of a street that's right here. The back sides of the pavilions are on your right. The fronts of the hotels are on your left, right? And that's the first solution that Jefferson comes to, and he's like, I just don't like that. So he takes his knife, he cuts it out, and he tries again. Right? And this is the second version. In this instance, he figures out, oh, wait a second, let's have all the gardens go back to back, and let's create different streets. Here's the street down here, and there's the street that one can walk along the lawn. So here we have the hotels. They're facing the outside. They have a great view, of course, west, across to the mountains, and we have this really wonderful sequence of these gardens on the backside. Yet he's still not happy. Now he's got the proportional relationships worked out, but still not really happy with that. And so he pitches that one. He doesn't actually pitch it because it survives, of course, but he removes that one and puts another piece of paper in and then produces the final solution, right? The final solution would be the resolution that has the hotels down here, but now in this third iteration, we finally get his famous serpentine walls, the curvilinear walls, which he would have seen in England when he was traveling with James Adams all through the English countryside. He translates that strategy to the gardens at the University of Virginia. So you can see this iterative process, trial and error at play in the development of the design. What's the one thing on this plan that I haven't noted yet that you've observed right away? Top left. Oh, there's a rotunda, right? Oh, wait a second. Jefferson now has this idea of a rotunda. And what's interesting about this is that this rotunda is modeled almost directly on the Parthenon. Sorry, the Parthenon. Pantheon. I always get those mixed up. Good gracious. The Pantheon, of course, the ancient Roman Pantheon. So Jefferson models his rotunda on the Pantheon. The great circular building, of course, in Rome, 1st century AD, and with its great portico. And you can see that there's actually a kind of a curved terrace, which has been paved out for accepting this new building. But what's interesting is that this is the very first drawing of the rotunda. The rotunda, that full sequence of drawings hasn't happened yet. So this is his first articulation of what would eventually become the rotunda. What's missing here, of course, is there's 5 pavilions on each side. We haven't even touched on pavilion 9. We know that this pavilion drawing is part of this early sequence, in part because it's also folded, right? And only the pavilions on this side are the folded pavilions. And so we know that he's produced this drawing pretty early, but it doesn't show up in the floor plan. It would be, no, site plan, it would be situated right here. And there's an interesting, and we'll come back to this, but there's this interesting observation. This is neither Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, it's sort of fundamentals, nor is it an ancient example of an ancient building. It's actually a modern design, right? And so Jefferson has this appeal for a modern design, but he doesn't yet know where to put it, right? So he's designed it, but he sets it aside. Okay, so just as a quick orientation then, now Jefferson is thinking about the rotunda. We've got the pavilions designed on this side. These 4 are under construction by 1818. By 1819, he turns his attention then to the east side of the lawn. So this is pavilion 2, the first pavilion he would design on the second side, the east side of the lawn. And what's interesting about this is that you can see in this floor plan, he's taken a totally different totally different approach for the main floor plan. This is the classroom. And you observe that the classroom, this is actually quite a bit larger than any of the classrooms that we've seen already on the west side. And when you go back to the letters between Jefferson and the Board of Visitors, there we have the evidence again. The Board of Visitors are complaining, and they're saying those classrooms are way too small. Right? Now Jefferson, this puts Jefferson in a pickle. He needs to create a larger classroom space to make the BOV happy, but at the same time he knows that if the size of the building grows too much, he's going to price himself out of finishing the project. Right? The whole architecture is going to become too expensive. So what's his solution? The earlier floor plans had a central passage. Right? You go into a door and there's a central passage. He's like, central passage, that's wasted space. So he abandons any kind of a central passage. He just creates this little nook. You go in this door, and then all of that space is given over to the classroom space. And then, again, upstairs, here we have the second floor, and this is the basement, the cellar plan, and of course the elevation, which you can see here, rendered at the top. What's also interesting about this is that Jefferson says that this is specifically taken from the Temple of Fortuna Virilis. The Temple of Fortuna Virilis is a very specific ancient Roman model of an Ionic temple. Which you can see here. And this is the rendering of that same model. And here, rather than just the column and the capital, Palladio has actually rendered the entire building. Right? And so what Jefferson is doing here is he's actually trying to replicate as best he can a specific ancient example, right? Rather than just the order itself. Now, between those two, meaning between pavilions 1 and 2, Jefferson, of course, is now, and we've seen this in the landscape design, already beginning to think through the rotunda, right? This great rotunda, which we know he's modeled on this ancient Roman building, which would be the preeminent example of ancient Roman architecture, especially of the Corinthian order. And we also are remembering now that that idea has this legacy. The seed has been planted way back with Benjamin Latrobe and Jefferson's correspondence. This is Jefferson's famous drawing of the elevation of the rotunda, probably his very best architectural drawing, bar none. Right? This is an extraordinary drawing. He spends a great deal of time. It's a very different scale. It's quite a bit larger than many of the others. And what do you notice about this? UVA, when we represent this on, I'm sure every one of you has either a cup or a sweatshirt or a t-shirt that has the logo on it somewhere. What do we include always? Right, that little bit of a circle. Now, is that circle real? Is it physical? Does it have material? No. The circle is an idea, right? The circle can't possibly exist because there's floors and walls in the way, right? This is a circle that exists mathematically. It's a circle that exists and it's important for Jefferson, but it's not a circle that a student would ever experience, right? It's part of the mathematical beauty of the building without actually being part of the experienced reality of the building. And we'll come back to that in just a second. What's fascinating about the drawings for the rotunda is, as with before, they're all from one sheet of paper, right? And so when you actually take the measurements and you actually sort of look at the numbers, the tiny little numbers along the side, I've reassembled them here into the single sheet of paper that they come from. And so when Jefferson produces the design for the rotunda, he's producing then this ancient Corinthian example, and we've got the Doric on this side and Ionic on that other side. Specific examples of ancient buildings from antiquity. By 1819, Jefferson has represented that he's completed the drawings on the far side, the east side of the lawn. And here we have pavilion 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. And I'm just going to show you one little problem with some of these that surfaced when I started doing this analysis. When we look at many of these drawings, you can reassemble the drawings that are on the east side. Pavilion 2 is on its own sheet of paper. Pavilion 10 is on its own sheet of paper. But 2, 4, and 6 are all taken from the same sheet of paper. What's fascinating about that is one of them's missing. Right? Do you see that we only have 3 of the 4 drawings? Well, that drawing shows up when we go to the collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Right? And what's fascinating about this is that this is a building that has floor plans, but it doesn't have an elevation. That elevation's actually been cut out. Right? And it perfectly matches the other 3. It's part of this whole sequence. This will be the final little problem we're going to seek to solve. When we look at the floor plan for this leftover pavilion, we can see that it's identical to the floor plan of 2. So once again, he's perfectly duplicating these floor plans as he's done before. But when you actually take the measurements of the grid itself, oh, wait a second, when we look at 8, do you see that that's not drawn on this piece of paper? That's actually a cutout, glued by Jefferson onto these other floor plans, cut out from this portion of the drawing. So this is the original drawing. Jefferson likes the elevation. He doesn't like the floor plan. He cuts it out and pastes it over here. Now what's fascinating about this is that this is a more complex elevation than all of the others. If you think about all the previous pavilion designs that Jefferson has produced, it's basically a brick box with the dropping of columns in front of it, right? This elevation is actually part of the building itself. Right? And you can actually see here, these are windows, and there's a little inset. When Jefferson makes the first elevation, he actually tries to have that same solution. There's just an elevation that he drops in front, which would be experienced more like a theater set, right? It's not actually spatial. It's not actually architectural. And so he realizes that that's a major error. So what he ends up doing is he throws this floor plan away and says, okay, I've got to do a better resolution. This is the final resolution where it's actually part of the floor plan itself, right? And you can see him making mistakes. You can see him pivoting. You can see him cutting sections out of some drawings and putting them to others. When we take a look at Pavilion 9, We can remember Pavilion 9, we were looking at that on the other side. It's the last one in that far sequence. Pavilion 9 is this modern design. Jefferson clearly likes it. He likes it from the very beginning, but he doesn't know what to do with it. It's modern in the sense that it's taken from other neoclassical designs of that period. But when you take a look at the very top, do you see that word up there? That's Latrobe. Latrobe. Jefferson gives design authority for this design to Benjamin Latrobe. And what's interesting about that is that when we take a look at Pavilion 10 is definitely by Jefferson's design, and we flip it over, here's the elevation for Pavilion 10, we see all of this text. This is a drawing that has more text than any of the other drawings. Jefferson is working out something really complex for the elevation, and that complexity is actually the integration of two different ancient examples into a single building. And so what Jefferson is doing for his final pavilion, the very last pavilion he designs, rather than basing it on a single model, he's actually trying to take two solutions and integrating them successfully into his final design, which means that we have Pavilion 8, which is referenced by Jefferson. He calls it Latrobe's Lodge Front, also a modern building. We have 9, which we've already identified as a contemporary or a modern design, and Jefferson here is trying to take in Pavilion 10 these ancient examples and integrate them also into a modern design. And so 8, 9, and 10 then is the solution to a sequence of contemporary designs by Jefferson for the conclusion of the Academical Village. So then we come back, and this will be my last question. We come back to this dilemma. The drawing of Pavilion 7, the drawing for the very first pavilion, has no notations on the back. Why?
Are they separate?
Great question. There are notations in a book, right? So he does actually also have notations separately, but that's not the answer. Why are there no notations? What?
You couldn't estimate because they didn't have the whole scale of the whole project.
Maybe it's a question about scale, but maybe think about timing. When do you think Jefferson produces this drawing? At the very end, in the sequence of my lecture, right? Jefferson doesn't produce this drawing to build Pavilion 7. Pavilion 7 is finished. And when he gets to the completion of Pavilion 10, he realizes, I've got a pretty good design drawing for 9 of my 10 pavilions. It doesn't have notations because he doesn't need notations. The building already exists, right? And so he is curating the completion of his finished sequence. All 10 drawings representing the full suite of the designs intended for use by the architectural lecturer. And in 1825, there's one letter in which Jefferson reveals this for us. And we'll conclude with this point. And he says, and the lecturer, in a circuit attended by his school, could explain to them successfully these samples of several orders, their varieties and particularities. Jefferson is imagining a lecturing circuit. 7, 5, and 3, the fundamentals of Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. 1, rotunda, 2, and 4, ancient examples. I'll skip 6 because it's complicated. 8, 9, and 10, modern examples, right? It's a tripartite lecture. 3 different lectures. The lectures on the fundamentals, then you can transition to study your ancient examples, and then once you've mastered your fundamentals and your ancient examples, then you're qualified to turn and make your own modern designs. It's a training pedagogy for the architectural lecturer, one that Jefferson never actually articulates for us, except in this one little phrase in one letter. So that's the conclusion of my sequence. It's the first portion of a chapter for the new book on Jefferson, in which we're looking really, really closely at the Academical Village, Thomas Jefferson, and his particular design sequences, trying to look especially at the drawings. What can the drawings tell us about Jefferson's evolving imaginary? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louis. We're going to go over time and do a few questions. If you're welcome to stay on and listen along. Here you go. Let me get this person here. We've got one.
So, Louis, 2 quick questions.
Yes, sir.
Do you find it telling that when the Rotunda Annex is built, it becomes one of those ugly buildings that is predisposed to fire? Because it's the only building that actually burns, right?
That's a great observation. Yep.
And no, that's the major one.
Yeah. So actually, Robert Mills, an understudy of Thomas Jefferson, designs a big sequence, big annex that goes where basically the Jefferson statue is today. That's the thing that catches on fire in the chemistry labs that burns the rotunda down, right? So Jefferson was right.
Here you go.
I was in a lecture about 20 years ago, and I think Professor Bell gave it. And he said at that time, no one had measured the pavilions to see if they actually adhere to Palladio's proportions. Has that been done since then, especially with the model you showed us?
We have the digital model that allows us to do that. So yes, the challenge is that there's, you have to take Palladian order. The Palladian measurements were intended by Jefferson only for 3 of the pavilions, right? And so you have to then take the specific dimensions of the exact models that Jefferson is considering to do that. And so I haven't done that full sequence. But Jefferson is incredibly particular about the proportions, and I expect that to be true as we continue this project.
One right here.
Yep.
On your earlier thing, and I was going to ask a question about that. If you've been, I know you've been to Monticello. We've all been to Monticello, probably. So he really stayed away from like hallways and staircases. He thought those spaces were not relevant to a useful space. And so, how far along is Monticello when he's developing these? I don't know the dates.
Complete.
It's complete.
So Monticello is a finished product by a decade before he starts.
Because you're comment about he's eliminating the hallway, which he had already done at Monticello.
That's exactly right. So he includes hallways, he abandons hallways, then very late in the project, he puts hallways back in, almost like he's forgotten. And so it's highly variable. And I think part of that is just the time pressure for drawing. If you look at the final drawing, the drawing for Pavilion 10, he doesn't even put in stair treads. The windows are very, very badly rendered. He's in a rush. Right? And so I think he's just not wanting to take the time to resolve the floor plan, and so he just duplicates an earlier floor plan.
And is the rotunda there are not a lot of drawings for revisions for the rotunda?
No, there are some, a great scholar by the name of Joseph LaSala has analyzed the rotunda drawings to show that there's a number of erasures. So Jefferson actually has certain dimensions of the design that he decides he doesn't like, and he actually just erases it right on the original and then replicates it. So there's definitely changes in his imagination over time, but not multiple drawings. Of course.
Why would some of these drawings be in Massachusetts?
That's a great question. And so in the late 19th century, all of Jefferson's drawings really get kind of curated. And the drawings that are presumed to be fundamental to the telling of the story all become part of one collection that comes to the University of Virginia in Special Collections. The Coolidge collection, the Coolidge family, ends up inheriting/purchasing basically the remnants. And so the Massachusetts Historical Society collection is actually the really great part, because it's kind of all the fragments and leftovers that help us better understand how all the other more curated pieces actually go together. So all the answers are actually in the Mass Historical Collection. Yeah.
You mentioned the Latrobe attribution for Pavilion 9. What about Ledoux?
Oh, I would love that. So Ledoux is this really prominent architect in Paris when Jefferson is there, a prominent so-called revolutionary architect in late 18th century France. Jefferson never once mentions Ledoux. He doesn't visit him, there's no correspondence, Boulez either. And so either of these two really prominent French architects, silenced by Jefferson, not a single note. And these are really prominent with major buildings in Paris while Jefferson is there. So it's not like you don't know these people exist, right? It's not possible to not encounter them. I think it's just an intentional, they're not classical enough, right? And so he kind of shuts them out. Yep.
I had a question. Yep. So what happens now from these drawings? Do they build off of these, or is there an interim step to the construction?
No, so yes and no. We have sets of drawings that are produced by some of the builders. And so an interesting part of the sequence is that Jefferson, together with the Board of Visitors and the Brockenbrough, who's the proctor for the university. He's negotiating all the contracts. Individually negotiates contracts for each of the different pavilions with the different house builders as a way of pitting them against one another to get the best price. And so through that process, some of those pavilions are redrawn by, and probably mid-construction or late construction, by builders. And so we do have sets of builders' drawings, but it's pretty clear that Jefferson's drawings are the drawing that's on site for the inauguration of the floor plan, the laying of the foundation, and sort of getting the process underway. One of the big challenges I have is the Pavilion 10 doesn't follow Jefferson's floor plan at all. And so this is really, really interesting. All the other pavilions, the pavilion maps onto the pavilion drawing as we've seen it. Pavilion 10, I got to figure something out there. Somebody goes rogue and introduces an entirely new floor plan, and that's just part of the question I haven't figured out yet.
Do you know why he started with 7 rather than 1 or 2? And did he have a pre-plan for each one?
So, what's fascinating about 7, he doesn't know what the whole composition is when he's building 7. Right? So he builds 7, he's like, this is where it's gonna be, but he doesn't know how far up it's gonna go, he doesn't know how far down it's gonna go, so the whole thing is still kind of gelatinous in his imagination when Pavilion 7, which is 2 years before the university is even founded, is under construction. And so it's kind of like planting a flag in the ground to say, here we start. But he kind of knows everything's gonna have to build around that. And what was your second question?
Did he have a plan for each one?
He did, absolutely. Well, with the exception of 7, right? I think when he gets to Pavilion 7, that building is already done before he produces the floor plan, but he definitely produces the floor plans before, well, that's not entirely true. There's one moment in which he says, go ahead and start building the foundation, start digging the foundation, I'm getting the drawing done. The foundation will be about this size, right? But in most instances, groundbreaking and foundation doesn't happen until the drawing is completed by Jefferson.
At what point does Jefferson decide to close in the Academical Village and add those like side wings to the rotunda?
Oh, so such a fascinating story. Y'all can leave if you want to, but I'll just keep talking. So the side wings to the rotunda are a really interesting project. Jefferson is actually recounted by Jefferson's daughter. This is late in his project, 1825, so it's really quite late. Jefferson he's not feeling well, he's sick, but he sits up in bed and has an idea, and he dictates the idea to one of his builders. And his daughter is in the room, and she describes this whole experience in this letter. But what he says is, I'm going to paraphrase, and that is, a student's mind can only be healthy if their body is healthy. And so those two wings are gymnasia. Jefferson is trying to create a space, a covered space, where men can throw medicine balls, can box, fence, and so those are actually our first gymnasia. And he also realizes that's a great way to resolve the end of the lawn, right? Is to create these kind of flanking components. And so when you walk down that walkway today, you're in what, an 8-foot wide narrow space. There are classrooms to your right-hand side as you're walking. Those classrooms don't exist, right? This is all one big open space for athletics. Yep.
Hold on.
Oh, are they brick foundation? Are they brick foundations? And if they are, is there a problem with rising damp?
Yes and yes. Of course. Yeah, they're actually not quite as deep as we would love. And actually, Ben Hayes was in the room. Yeah, here he is. You want to talk about rising damp? We've got the expert from facilities who...
No, I actually have a question for you. I don't want to talk about rising damp. Actually, an interesting thing we learned in the rotunda renovation was that not only are there brick foundations, but there's inverted arch brick foundations. So under the windows, there's brick arches that are upside down, which was an early way of trying to spread load in between along the foundation. So that's all I'll say on that. I'm curious, in the text of on the reverse side of this, if there's anything about the hanging balconies, because I don't think there's classic precedent for them. They're a huge construction challenge, obviously. Okay, so nothing.
Nope.
And then the second part of that question, well, you can answer the first part, but do you have a thought as to whether or not the balcony in the rotunda, which had a 2-story column in front of it, also had wrought iron tension rods that would have hung that balcony? Obviously, it's burned, so we don't know, but it's kind of a question of how that would have connected to the column otherwise.
So interestingly, we were just debating that very question with Brian Hogg about a week and a half ago in a meeting you missed. I believe that Brian Hogg, who I think is watching, and I hope he doesn't chastise me if I get this wrong, I believe Brian Hogg does believe that there were iron rods holding that balcony together. There are no clear designs by Jefferson for the hanging balcony. He clearly assumes them because there's doors, and those doors go out to something, but he doesn't resolve that, which is just a reminder for us that the builders, the carpenters, the masons are doing a ton of design resolution as part of this project. So that's a different chapter of the book, and that is, it's not all Jefferson. There's lots of other people here making all kinds of design decisions.
Basically, it collapses during one of the recent, within the past, what, 15 years?
Yeah, it was about 10 years ago. Yeah, sure. So the balcony of Pavilion 1 is the balcony that collapsed during a graduation a number of years ago to tragic effect. The question is there some kind of design solution? No, I think it was the first of the bad ones that was going to go, right? There were a number that had, so the Office of the Architect and Facilities went in and actually did a pretty major intervention right after that to examine all the rest of them. And so they're all quite stable now, but they were all just not really well, I mean, the 18th century, the early 19th century doesn't resolve a hanging balcony very well, right? That's just not a common thing. Jefferson is creating a design condition that people just don't really resolve much in the period when he's doing this. It's a great innovation, but it introduces engineering failure. Yep. Oh, are we done?
Where are we?
Well, that's true too, because it's exposed. Yeah.
I can't get to everybody.
That particular rod and that particular balcony are the most exposed because it's at the end, and so it had water failure and rust that probably undermined its structural stability. There was another question in the back.
Here you go.
I was just curious, did Jefferson see the end result? You said he was sick.
He was sick. He did see. He saw the first 5 months of students arrive at the university. Just prior to, sorry? Well, I wasn't going to say that, but yes. There's two great events that happened in those few weeks. One is prior to the university's opening, Jefferson entertains the Marquis de Lafayette, who he hasn't seen in years, but has been his great, great friend, in a grand dinner in the as yet unfinished ballroom, dome room of the Rotunda, which is really just a fantastic story. Jefferson is there for that. Jefferson also, because of a riot of the students, is one of the only moments in which he's publicly seen crying, is because his grand new university, which he expects to shepherd students towards character and virtue, he realizes students end up rioting, and it's his own nephew that starts the riots. Anyway, I think we'll close there. Thank you all so much for your time and attention.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out, and it's good to see everybody in person, and thank you all for joining online. Lewis, on behalf of Lifetime Learning, we have a gift for you and appreciate your passion and research. Thank you.
Olive oil or wine?
Don't do your drawings while you're working on that.
Okay, good. That's right. Don't spill it on my drawings, right?
Well, thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you all so much for coming.